During this video, we're just going to cover some basic introductory thoughts for you to have some foundation for the rest of the class. So the first thing I want to look at, if you use the accompanying introductory notes, you'll see this list of terms that you might have some familiarity with, some ignorance with, or some in-between knowledge of. Under the Latino terms, what do we know? You'll see about 9-10 different terms. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just a list of a sample. Latino or Latin, Hispanic, Spanish, Mexican, Chicano, Mestizo, Indio, Nuyorican, Indigenous, and then lastly, other countries plus American, like Cuban American or Mexican American or Brazilian American, etc. All of these terms you might have used at one time or another. I suspect there's a few that some of you are hearing for the first time. In terms of the two most common and most widely used, probably Latino and Hispanic would top the list, and they both are set about using the same sort of guidelines, and that would be largely to label the largest amount of people within one label. Latino meaning anybody who has a Latin American ancestry, including Mexican, Central American, South American, and yet is here in the United States. Hispanic also sort of produces the same sort of definitive guidelines. Somebody who is got Latin American cultural roots and ancestry, but is yet here in the United States. When we say Latino versus Latin American, oftentimes we're making the distinction of ancestral roots here in the United States versus present-day existence in parts of Latin America. So somebody who is Latin American is living in the Dominican Republic or in Nicaragua or in parts of South, they would be in Latin America, and if they are here in the United States, they would then be Latino. The problems with these two largely used terms is that they, number one, they ignore a lot of the diversity amongst the ethnic identity, right? We hear in the root Latino or Latin American, we hear the Latin root, which emphasizes language, and Spanish is the predominant language of the early colonizers, and so the identifier of Latin, which Spanish is a Latin-based language, precludes any idea that the natives, which these colonizers encountered on their first expeditions, are not any viable component of their identity, which is of course false. So it highlights the European-centered contributions to identity, and so we begin to embark on a thread of Eurocentric historical identity, right? Hispanic has the very same connotation to it, right? Hispanic or Spanish as the European identity moniker is highlighted, right? The other thing about Hispanic that may not be known to most people is that this term was created as part of a government impetus to define Spanish-speaking, quote-unquote, populations in the United States in order to help inform census data. Okay, so it's got an official sort of definition motive behind it. Okay, going down the list, Spanish is used incorrectly a lot of times to define people, right? And the only correct way to use this as a definer of people is to talk about people who are directly from Spain, right? Somebody from Mexico may speak the language identified as Spanish, but it in fact is not Spanish. Okay? And you may laugh at this because you've probably heard it used in that way several times. Mexican, of course, is a national identifier, but it's also been sort of transferred to mean cultural identifier, as in somebody who identifies as Mexican but is very much born in the United States and has lived all of their life in the United States, but culturally still identifies themselves as Mexican or maybe sometimes Mexican American. But it should be noted that it can be used as a proper national identifier, somebody who is a Mexican national, or also an ethnic definer. Chicano is an interesting one. Literally, it refers to people who are Mexican American, generations of Mexican ancestral progeny who were born in the United States or who migrated to the United States at a young age and have been quote-unquote Americanized. But beyond that, it's got more political and social and historical contributions that we'll get into a little bit later. But for our purposes here, we need to understand that Chicano is a referent to a very specific generation, i.e. late 50s into the 60s, who began adopting a political and social stance for civil rights for Mexican Americans. And what it created was a sort of generational shift from assimilative Mexican American identities to empowering, youthful, driven Chicano identities that largely defined the Mexican American civil rights movement. And we'll have a discussion on that, particularly when we move into the political module later on. Mestizo is a word that means a mixture, and predominantly the mestizo that we're talking about here is the product of early colonization efforts. The Indians of the North American and Central American and South American continents who encountered the Spanish colonists over time began to merge with them and produce children and generations of mestizos. And the mestizo is largely the modern day product of these generations and generations of integration. Indio is just the term for indigenous or Indian, populations of the Americas. Obviously, in North America, the United States is very well-known tribal labels and identifiers, while Central America and South America have many, many different tribal affiliations as well. The most well-known, of course, would be the Aztecs and the Mayas, but there are multiple tribes of indigenous in this area as well. Nuyorican is just one of these terms. I could have chosen a number of others, but Nuyorican is a creative way of discussing hybrid cultures in the United States who have over time began to merge and integrate different cultural identifiers to create something that is new. Nuyorican is a combination of New York and Puerto Rican, and the distinct cultural identifiers that separate them from being strictly New York, quote unquote, or strictly Puerto Rican, etc. Indigenous, of course, means First Peoples who are native to this land, etc. One of the things that's important about looking at all of these labels and any other labels that you might have questions about is that in any attempt to define culture, we as a people need to properly understand that cultural definitions are problematic when we make them widespread or blanket in terms of their definers. The three-word phrase that I've got listed there on your notes, culture is heterogeneous, means largely that, yes, we can define culture by labels and group names and traits and specificities, but we have to understand that even within those definitions, the diversity is tantamount. We must recognize that saying that all Latinos speak Spanish is, of course, false. We have indigenous languages. We have the introduction of other colonial inhabitants that brought other languages, and so saying anything as a true cemented concrete cultural definer is always going to have this ringing in the background. Culture is heterogeneous. Okay, moving along down the notes there, a couple of reasons that we want to study Latinos in the United States. Some of these should be fairly well evident, especially here in the 21st century. Population growth. And if you look at the accompanying PowerPoint slide that I've put there, I'm not going to go through that. I'm going to allow you to look at it on your own. But read the self-explanatory slides, and you can see from the most recent 2010 data the trends of Latinos in the U.S. and in Nebraska specifically, in Omaha, and finally on down to UNO, our most immediate cultural scene. We can see the trend towards growth, and there are many narratives out there projecting the increased rapid growth, 2020 and 2030 and 2050 as potential markers of substantiated Latino growth in the United States. So that's reason one as to why it's important to have a class like this. Reason two is less specific and more sort of poetic in terms of saying that the American experience is not fixed. It's not sort of done, right? The idea of what it means to be American and the American history narrative is continuously being written. Okay, so to package something up and to say that we're done studying this is of course, it's short-sighted and it's ignorant, and it sort of precludes any idea that, well, what it means to be American is done and over, and we simply have to adhere to that. That's not true. The United States is in flux. Culture moves and grows. And one of the things that we'll be charting over the next 5 weeks is immigration is always in the news, of course, but usually the way that it's in the news is in terms of border security and policies and the way, what this means for employment and that sort of thing. But very often these discussions ignore things like cultural traits and immigration and familial dissemination and all of these other things. So we need to understand that the American experience is multi-layered, and it suggests that there are multiple narratives of American growth. And that's a solid reason to continue to study, along with the fact that the population, the empirical data itself, is growing over this time as well. One other thing that I want to get at, just some headline information. As we study Latinos in the United States, Chicanos, Mexican Americans, whatever way we go about entering into this term, there are 6 keys of historical experiences of Latinos that are common across all ethnicities, and even what I'm saying there is should be heard and taken in with that culture is heterogeneous. So these 6 keys, and you'll see that on your notes there's actually 7. I'm not sure why that's been labeled in an old text as 6 keys of historical experience that Latinos share and what makes the study of them worthwhile. Number 1, historical roots are very, very similar. Okay, history of wars and revolutions and treaties, etc., have long contributed to number 3, which is immigration patterns. right? When we get into our immigration section, we'll talk largely about what we sometimes call push-pull narratives, something pushing them out and something pulling them in, okay? And Latinos in the United States have very similar historical antecedents that lead to those immigration patterns, right? And that fits right in with number 2, conquest. Many of these nations at one time or another in their history were colonized from European outside colonizers, and even prior to that, tribal conquests in between and backfighting were ongoing. So wars and treaties and resultant treaties that come afterwards, they share in common. And when we isolate different sections from Mexico to the Caribbean to parts of South America, you'll see the way that these patterns kind of stretch across multiple countries, regions, etc., but they're kind of very similar across those. Skip over immigration because we mentioned that, but they have a labor experience that they've shared. A huge portion of the American labor force, largely manual, but don't kid yourself, that's not the only way that Latinos have entered into the American labor force. But especially in the late 19th into the 20th century, this has been a huge portion of their experience in the United States. And we have a section on labor that will look very specifically at Latinos' importance and contributions to the American labor force. Okay. Number 5, racialization. This is a little bit harder to understand. If we understand our earlier discussion about labels and branding and who is this, are they Latino, are they Spanish, are they this and that? Well, along with that comes stereotypes. And the construction of stereotypes is very, very interesting. We've all heard about discrimination, which is acts upon stereotypes, and prejudices, which are ideas that we form based on small group information. And stereotypes are the attitudes that we carry because of those prejudices. And stereotypes largely define our, and when I say our, I mean larger communal American preconception of who Latinos are. And we'll spend some time looking into those a little bit later. Number 6 says struggle over time. Various civil rights agenda and civil rights movements have existed, probably the most common being the 1960s concurrent civil rights movement with other famous United States civil rights, the African American, Native American, gender and sexual revolutions happening at the same time. And then that bleeds right into the 7th of the 6 key historical experiences, but change. Okay, and this will sort of preclude all of our class, the idea that Latinos' experiences in the United States have changed, right? And that Chicano identity in particular is the identity that they're no longer a Mexican national, but yet not fully what we would consider an American. So this Chicano identity emerges between those two worlds, between those borders. And I've got there in parentheses this quote from the very famous film Selena, which came out, I believe, in the late 1990s, about the Texas-born Latina singer who was tragically shot and killed by the president of her fan club. But within that film, there's a scene where Selena's father makes mention of living as a Mexican American, and you have to be more Mexican than the Mexicans and more American than the Americans. And this is largely the experience of change that happens of Latinos in the contemporary United States. I'll leave it at that for today. This will give you some background. This video will be here for you to refer back to. All of these concepts we will explore in depth a little bit more later, but this will give you some preface into your reading. Thank you very much.